Last month, Canadians elected a parliament that they expect to work together, and that's exactly what I'm going to be focusing on doing.
This country is more divided than it ever has been. We need to get to work as quickly as possible so that we can address the priorities of Canadians and bring our country closer together.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is laying the groundwork this week for a new minority parliament. Earlier this morning, he met with Conservative leader Andrew Scheer, as well as Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, and he's scheduled for sit-downs with other political leaders before federal politicians return to Parliament Hill next month. Trudeau announced today he will convene Parliament on December 5th. MPs will elect a new House of Commons Speaker. The government's throne speech will follow, delivered by the Governor-General. That's after Trudeau unveils his cabinet picks next Wednesday. It's still unclear how exactly he'll represent Alberta's or Saskatchewan's interests in that cabinet after the Liberals were shut out of those provinces. So what did we learn from today's meetings? And the CBC's Salima Shivji joins us now. Hi, Salima.
Hello.
So let's start with that first meeting with Andrew Scheer. What happened there?
Yeah, rather predictable outcome, I would have to say. It was not a very long meeting, about less than 30 minutes. And right off the bat, actually, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, sort of undercut one of Andrew Scheer's major demands, which was to bring Parliament back a little bit earlier. November 25th was the date that Andrew Scheer wanted to hear from the Prime Minister, and Justin Trudeau has chosen 10 days after that. So December 5th, as you mentioned, after the NATO summit in London. Didn't really bode well sort of for the tone of the meeting, but I guess not so surprising. Scheer sort of focused on his message that the nation is more divided than ever. We've heard that a fair bit from him. He did hint at a few areas of common ground, though. He talked about some of the similar campaign platforms that the Liberals and the Conservatives had, making maternal and paternal benefits tax-free. There was some tax cuts that could be some movement as well, transit funding for cities like Toronto. But here's what Andrew Scheer had to say when he talked about whether he would support the throne speech or not.
We told him what we expected based on the fact, the support our party got in the last election. It's up to Mr. Trudeau to find common ground to get his throne speech passed. So I highlighted the areas that we would be focusing on, the parts of our platform that we believe should be implemented. And it's up to him to decide what to do with that.
So there you go, up to him to decide what to do about it. What Scheer expects, he has a list of 7 demands, actually, and they're fairly big demands. He talked about, wanting to create a national energy corridor, which he had talked about a lot in the election campaign. Also, he'd like to see 2 key bills repealed, C-48 rather, and C-69, and the Trudeau Liberals have said, no, we're not going to do that, so not a lot of chance for common ground there. Senior Liberals say that they are still working on representing Alberta and Saskatchewan, that they are concerned about what voters are thinking, but that doesn't necessarily mean those are the same concerns as what Andrew Scheer is voicing.
And to remind our viewers, C-69 is, of course, the big environmental legislation passed earlier this year that was all about sort of reforming the way a big project like a pipeline is approved. Speaking of pipeline, the Prime Minister also sat down next with Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe. We have him on the show in a few moments, but there are other meetings planned with other opposition leaders throughout this week.
There are, yeah. It's a part of a string of meetings with premiers as well as opposition leaders. Of course, you'll hear from Premier Moe. He was clearly not so happy with how that meeting went. You'll hear the details from that. But basically, this is about finding common ground and hearing from these people and what they would like to see from this new minority government. It's a bit of a work in progress for the Prime Minister. He will be meeting tomorrow with Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet. Now, he has already said that he is happy with the return date of Parliament, December 5th, and that he does have things that he wants to talk about, so namely compensation for dairy farmers, as well as health transfers and fossil fuel subsidies. So those will be some of the topics on the order sheet for tomorrow with that meeting. Justin Trudeau will sit down with Jagmeet Singh of the NDP the following day on Thursday, and then on Friday, Green Party parliamentary leader Elizabeth May. So lots of meetings for Justin Trudeau.
And then next week, it's the new cabinet. Thanks, Salima.
You're welcome.
CBC's Salima Shivji. And as Salima mentioned, Prime Minister Trudeau met with the Premier of Saskatchewan earlier today. Did they find any common ground? Scott Moe is the Premier of Saskatchewan. He joins me now in studio. Hi, Premier Moe. Pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure's all mine, Betsy.
Thank you very much for coming in studio. It's nice to have you here in person. You emerged from the meeting with the Prime Minister. You said you were disappointed. You went in with, you detailed 3 priorities, on equalization, the carbon tax, and expanding export markets. When you say that you were disappointed in the meeting. Does that mean that the Prime Minister would not give on anything?
Yeah, we came to this meeting in good faith to work with the Prime Minister as per his words on election night when he had indicated that he had heard the frustration in the West, in the province of Saskatchewan, and that he was going to look to support the people of the province. And so we had provided 3 opportunities for him to turn those words into action, to actively work with the province on moving forward on a climate plan that actually truly does reduce emissions and doesn't harm the economy, to move forward on a fair equalization program, and to ensure that TMX is not the last project that it gets built in this nation.
So I just want to be clear, though, for our viewers, when you say that there wasn't movement, does that mean, for example, if you said, are you willing to reopen or look at the equalization formula, you got a hard no? If you said, are you willing to pause, as you've said in a letter previously, the carbon tax for a year, did you get a hard no?
The fact of the matter is the Prime Minister is not willing to look at each of these opportunities to work with the people of the province.
He said that explicitly to you?
He's not willing to put the carbon taxation policy on pause. It's a harmful policy. We've asked for it to be removed, not only across the board, but also to be removed from farmers' grain drying bills this fall. For an example, we've had a tough harvest in the province. We have a lot of tough grain in areas. We have some that's still out, and we've asked for a reprieve, if you will, in certain areas of the economy like that. We would also say that is a prime example of why this ineffective policy should be removed across the board. It doesn't work. It simply doesn't work in our province for sure. But we've always.
How do you know that so far, that it doesn't work?
It doesn't.
It does work in other jurisdictions.
It will very quickly in an exporting-based province like Saskatchewan, where we have a natural resource-based economy. Very quickly, will reduce jobs and cause that direct investment to go into other areas of the world. We're seeing it in the energy industry, most notably, with that investment going south of the border. So it moves investment, moves jobs. Ultimately, does not reduce emissions.
Is it that though? Well, how do you? First of all, how do you know that it doesn't reduce emissions? Because it is in place in other places where it has reduced emissions. I'm thinking of Sweden and Britain, for example. How do you know that it won't do that? And B, how do you know for sure that it's going to drive investment out? The price of oil has something to do with that as well, doesn't it?
It's already driven investment south of the border. In the case of the Bakken oil field, of which we share with the United States, and the investment in North Dakota and Montana far exceeds the opportunity for investment that we're able to attract.
But are you saying that's just because of the carbon tax? I mean, it's a different product as well.
It's A, because of the carbon tax. It's B, because of our inability to be able to get those products to market. It's C, in general, the federal government's policies that are driving that investment out of our province, driving those jobs out of our province, and I think in many ways they're speaking to the sentiments that we saw manifest themselves on election night in our province.
Were you willing to bend on some issues coming to the table? You're framing this as the Prime Minister essentially not willing to give at all. What were you willing to give?
We're most certainly willing to work with the Prime Minister, the federal government, and always have been, on a real climate plan in Saskatchewan that addresses our 30% target, Canada's 30% target at the Paris Accord. That is what all of the premiers agreed to at the Vancouver Declaration, and that ultimately is what we have always attempted to work towards, not just taxing the hardworking families in Saskatchewan. That being said, it's provincial jurisdiction, and if there are other areas of the nation that feel that is the appropriate tool, we would more than certainly, think that they should be able to do that.
So what are you saying? What are you therefore willing to give up? I'm not really clear. You're saying you were willing to put forward. I know you have your own plan to reduce emissions, but that's not really a give. I'm saying, are you willing to sort of, let's say, be okay with Bill C-69 or Bill C-48, or leave the carbon tax in place for the next few years if farmers could get a rebate? Let's say, like, were there those kinds of negotiations? Because the accusation being leveled against you is that this is sort of you coming here and saying it's all on you, Prime Minister, and then saying he's not willing to give anything up. What were you willing to do?
Most certainly, we want to engage in a conversation that is focused on emissions reduction, is focused on our opportunity to sequester more carbon into our soils. We are not focused, and we never have been, focused on a taxation policy that is going to harm the jobs based in environmental policy, but is going to harm our opportunity to attract jobs to our communities. We are all about talking and discussing emissions-based plans and discussing the results of what Saskatchewan is already delivering, will continue to deliver. But with respect to a carbon tax, that isn't going to work for Saskatchewan.
But with respect to the question, does that mean that you went to the Prime Minister today saying, well, I'm willing to reach our targets as the
Absolutely.
sort of, that's it? Was there anything else that
Well,
you're
isn't that
willing
what
to bet on?
isn't that the goal? Is to reach our targets? Isn't that the goal of the entire carbon tax? Is so that we can reach our Paris
shouldn't that also
Accord
be a
commitment?
given that you're willing to reach them? I mean, I'm just unclear of if you want the Prime Minister to comply with your three identified priorities. Right. What exactly are you willing to do to meet him halfway?
We can reach our targets. That's the goal. That's why they're imposing the carbon tax on the hardworking people of the province. Listen, this is the challenge that we have in Saskatchewan and in other areas of this nation right now, where we are contributors over the course of the last decade financially to the success of Canada, and we're happy to do that. If we are allowed to continue to expand the sustainable resources that we have, to expand the industries that are creating jobs in our communities. Federal policies like carbon taxation, federal policies like Bill C-69, federal policies that are hindering the construction of pipelines, cramping our ability to get our not only our oil, but our grain and our potash to market, are hindering our ability to provide that growth and provide those opportunities for the next generation. This is where the frustration is building in Saskatchewan.
So does that mean, am I to interpret that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that you would be willing to step back from, for example, the wish that the equalization formula be revisited, or the demand that the equalization formula be revisited, if the government were to comply with, let's say, the reprieve of the carbon tax for a year?
The equalization formula and the fiscal stabilization formula, they need to be revisited because they are inequitable, they're not fair to all provinces, and they need to be fair so that we are sharing that wealth in a fair way across the nation. Listen, we had the three provinces over the course of the last 5 years that have the lowest GDP growth, Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, are also the three provinces that continue to contribute to equalization. So we have a flawed formula. That needs to be
But you know that
at.
is because of the formula. It's about the province's ability to raise revenue, basically.
It's also but it's not a reactive formula that is allowing areas that have a downturn in their economy any type of support, if you will, and that is showing through the last number of years. So the two formulas need to be revisited to ensure that they're fair to all provinces. In saying that, the further challenge we have is our ability to continue to grow and create wealth in our province because of the federal government policies that are coming out. Now, given that's part of the challenge is some natural resource prices as well. But the piling on of the federal government with their bills C-48, 69, with the carbon tax policy are affecting the investment into the industries in Saskatchewan. They're affecting our jobs and they're affecting our opportunity into the future.
The thing is, it sounds like you're asking for A, B, C, D, E to happen without saying you're willing to do anything else. Like, did you come here looking for this fight, or were you actually here willing to work on meeting in the middle?
Absolutely. No, we came here looking to work with the federal government. We did not come here to look for a fight, although we're not scared to, we won't be backing away from one either. But the fact of the matter is the Prime Minister on election night said he understood the frustrations in Saskatchewan. He said he wanted to be there to support us. We have put forward some opportunities to collaborate with him and with the federal government on how he can do that. We need to take a different path. It's the policies of the last 4 years that have created this frustration, and we need to adjust those policies, and that's what we have offered to the Prime Minister, is some guidance on how to do that and some opportunities to collaborate on how to do that.
Does that mean that he put forth no suggestions of his own? Were there any offerings from the Prime Minister that just didn't fit into your list?
Oh, we talked about the opportunities for infrastructure, of which we have been talking about previous to this. We talked about if there's some opportunities in the way of supporting some of the grain drying costs that we have as well.
Would that be a rebate in the form of the carbon tax?
That'll be up to the Prime Minister. We asked for it to be removed from the gas drying from the drying bills, but also asked it to be removed from the broader agricultural economy as well. As what we're doing is growing food in one of the, if not the most sustainable agricultural industry in the world.
And did he say no to all of that?
No, he was open to having a conversation around that. It sounds like what we need is action, and that's what we'll be looking for. We'll be looking for action on a number of fronts. Action that'll be supporting, and to use his own words, the people of the province.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Premier Moe. Pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I came with real opportunities for us to engage on behalf of the people that I represent in that province. Opportunities that I was hoping to work with the Prime Minister and the new federal administration, the minority government that we have in our nation here today. I did not hear a willingness to work on those priorities. We have no such plans for that referendum on equalization as we speak, although I have repeatedly and again today will not rule that out. We are going to look at every opportunity that we have to ensure that Saskatchewan is being well represented not only within the nation of Canada, but we're being well represented around the world. And where there are opportunities for us to expand our provincial autonomy, we're going to look at them very seriously.
Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe met with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau this morning. Moe came with a list of demands, but says he's going home empty-handed. So just what happened in that meeting, and is this a preview of what to expect with the new minority government? Time for the Power Panel to weigh in. Former Conservative Cabinet Minister Stockwell Day joins us from Vancouver. Murray Mandryk of the Regina Leader-Post is in the Saskatchewan capital, and in Toronto, political columnist and commentator Tiffany Gooch here with me in studio. Another political commentator and former NDP MP Françoise Boivin. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Murray, let me start with you. I know that you saw the press conference or the scrum that the Premier gave coming out of that meeting. Anything, what do you specifically take away from that?
Well, there isn't much room to compromise, according to Scott Moe, in this province. He came with a list of demands. He left without anything guaranteed, which I don't think is particularly shocking, given the fact he was addressing a new Prime Minister that's 1 or 2 days into his role. But obviously that wasn't good enough for Scott Moe today, and sent very much a message, I think, to his people back home that he's dissatisfied. Whether we should be colored surprised by that, I don't particularly know. We have the most arable farmland in Canada, but perhaps the least amount of nuanced territory when it comes to our politics. There wasn't much nuance in Scott Moe's position. I got nothing from Ottawa, and I wanted everything that I kind of demanded, and I don't know where we go from there. I guess, interestingly, it'll be interesting to see if the Prime Minister deems it appropriate to respond to Scott Moe, and that might be the problem, because one of the frustrations out here is it seems from a Saskatchewan perspective, the Prime Minister of current has never deemed it appropriate to respond to Saskatchewan-Alberta concerns.
Tiffany, what do you think? What was the significance of this meeting, and is it also significant that Premier Moe walked away saying there wasn't really a lot of give, like the Prime Minister wouldn't comply with anything that I offered as far as areas we could work together on?
So I'd say the significance of the meeting is that for each Premier, it's this opportunity to set the agenda for what will be important for you and the people in your province moving forward. And of course, Scott Moe will want to appear that he's fighting for as much as is needed for the people living in his province that at this moment are feeling and wondering and worried about what ways this government's going to come to understand them. That said, I would have expected or hoped for a little bit more of a collaborative approach. If you're coming with red line demands, there's also needs to be some exchange of areas that you're identifying some level of common ground on, and he came out swinging a little bit harder than will leave him room to escalate from here. And so I'd say as the narrative continues to build from here as to who's coming together and looking for common ground between all of the premiers when they come together with the Council of the Federation, but then also with the federal leaders as they begin to come together and this government works together. I'd say his tone is quite strong for what may need to be brought together for what common ground looks like, and so he may see himself more and further offside to those that are finding ways to work together and finding ways to move forward. And the more sort of alienation you build to those relationships as people are trying to work together, the harder it is to rebuild those after. So we'll see how he escalates from here.
Stockwell, Tiffany brings up an interesting point just around sort of who is willing to give what. I interviewed Premier Moe at the beginning of the show and asked multiple times sort of, I understand you've outlined exactly where you want the Prime Minister to give, but where exactly are you willing to give? Is there actually going to be any kind of meeting in the middle? And the only indication he said was that, you know, he put forward a plan to meet the targets that Saskatchewan had set to reduce emissions. But beyond that, there was really nothing else concrete that he said that, you know, he could meet in the middle with the Prime Minister. Do you think that that is sort of the way in which these discussions go moving forward, or is there the possibility of common ground?
Well, it may be, Vashi, and I hope you've indicated wondering if this is going to be a trend. Sometimes these first meetings do set a bit of a trend, but I hope this isn't what's going to be reality. I'm actually a bit surprised. Premier Moe, as I know him, and I think as most people who've seen him, even through television, he's a fairly reasonable guy. He's not mercurial in terms of getting set off easily. And a great chance for the Prime Minister, I would think, to even go the extra kilometer, and knowing that there's an extreme feeling of alienation in Western Canada. It's not that difficult to go to a meeting with somebody, even if you've got a bunch of stuff that you don't necessarily agree with, to say, you know what, we'll take a look at this. You know, thanks for bringing this forward. I don't know how much we can do, but we're going to take a look. It doesn't take a high level of diplomacy from a Prime Minister to come out of a meeting like that with at least the other side saying, well, the guy said he was going to listen, so, you know, let's see what happens. Sounds like that wasn't the case. So I'm a bit surprised, and I hope the Prime Minister isn't underestimating the gauge of alienation that's being felt in Western Canada right now.
It's an interesting point as well, Françoise, because it seemed like from Premier Moe, at least his comments, we haven't heard from the Liberal government. We will have a representative on later, but that there wasn't, you know, for example, the demands he had were around equalization and the carbon tax. I don't think many of us expect the government to roll over in any way on the carbon tax, but on equalization, there could have been at least some kind of okay, we're willing to have that conversation. He indicated that that was ruled out by the Prime Minister. We'll ask, of course, the Liberals as well, but what do you think?
Well, as a negotiator, I thought it was both sides having their first meeting together and stating their position. Yes on one side, no on the other. And now all the work will have to start once he forms his cabinet, who's going to be in charge of that file, because it's going to be harsh negotiations with those Western provinces. And if those Western provinces think that they'll be alone asking for things, if they see that the federal government has to be a bit more lenient on certain formula, you can bet your life that other provinces will come with their own demands. So for me, I was not surprised either by one, then the other. Premier Moe had his position. It would have been surprising to me that he would come with a conciliatory tone for the sole reason that they're pretty much on a, excuse the expression, but kind of on a war path. They're preparing the ground for the negotiations to come. So they're stating a pretty obsolete, a more grand thing that they will really have at the end. And for the Prime Minister, he's still forming his cabinet. We don't know what mandate he will give to the people that will have part of being in charge of those files. So we'll see. So he's saying exactly what we heard him say all the time, no surprise. And but they will meet later. They will have other occasions to meet. And I do hope they all take very seriously what's happening, because my God, I used to being a Quebecer, that was always about us moving maybe outside the Federation, and now we're hearing the West talking about the same things that Quebec have been talking for so long. So it's like the world in reverse in a lot of aspects, but I hope that every leader breathe by the nose and decide to, you know, let's do the right thing for our people in Canada first and foremost. But this meeting for me was just a start.
Murray, what is the context in Saskatchewan for the kinds of demands, for example, that Premier Moe was making? What is the sense among people there about what they are hoping their premier gets out of a meeting like this?
Well, the base loved his comments today because it is that anti-Trudeau. Otherwise, I don't know how this was effective either from a macro or a micro standpoint. If the issue is how to stop Western separation and talk thereof and do your part as a premier, I don't think it was a very effective strategy on the part of the Saskatchewan premier today, because I think this kind of feeds into that particular sentiment. But even from a micro standpoint, they say that we can't do much in terms of the carbon tax, and I think people get that out here. There is those accepting that Eastern Canada and elsewhere voted in favor of the Liberals, and the majority of people voted for a government that was supportive of a carbon tax. But there are specific issues out here, one of them being a silly one. It's a bit of a niche issue, even in Saskatchewan, but it's the carbon tax on natural gas as it applies to farmers drying the grain. And as you can see from behind me, it's really cold and snowy out, and there's farmers still out in their fields trying to dry their grain and get it done. Now, that really didn't come up as an issue today in which Scott Moe could say, well, at least I got this, or we're not certain at this particular point whether he even asked, although one suspects his position is, I want everything gone related to the carbon tax, and I don't even want to sort of discuss individual issues. If that's the case, I don't think he's being particularly helpful to himself, his own cause, and I sure don't understand how he's being helpful to dissuade those who might lead towards the WeEx movement.
I have to take a commercial break, but I did want to just quickly touch on, I think the last thing I asked him about was that, because I know that had come from the opposition leader in Saskatchewan as well, Ryan Miley. They were kind of asking for rebates at the very least for those farmers that have been so enormously affected because of their wet crops and paying for the drawing of the grain. And he said that the Prime Minister was open to considering it. So we'll ask the Liberal government about that as well later in the show and see what exactly they are willing to consider, if anything at all.
Well, I spoke to the Prime Minister about the very real crisis that our country is in as it relates to national unity. So I spoke about how my proposal of a national energy corridor merited some work and some study to see if that can be implemented, or at least the early work started. Spoke about the need to demonstrate a roadmap for the Trans Mountain pipeline to be completed, to show Western Canadians that there's going to be progress on that. Spoke about helping Canadians get ahead, some of the broad-based tax cuts that we were proposing in the election campaign. Seem to have found some common ground on things like tax-free maternity and parental leave benefits.
That was Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer after his meeting this morning with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Welcome back to Power and Politics, and the Power panel with Stockwell Day, Marie Mandrick, Tiffany Gooch, and Françoise Boismas. Stockwell, I'll start with you. What do you make of how the meeting turned out?
We're in a time of an amazing paradox and almost historic here, and people from outside Canada must be looking on with some interest, because here we've got a situation where we've just had an election. The Prime Minister, who went in with a significant majority, threw it away and now has a minority. But his leadership appears to be intact. The opposition leader, who significantly increased the number of seats, has a strong minority, increased fundraising, and won the majority of votes. In fact, his leadership is not intact. So it's an interesting paradox here. And the challenge for Andrew Scheer, he has to do what an opposition leader does, and it sounds like he did it today, in terms of appearing and offering to be a government in waiting. He brought forward the policies that they ran on, and as he should. But at the same time, he's got to also appear and appeal to his own base, saying that he's not just a leader in waiting, but in fact, he is the leader. And when he's doing all of these things that an opposition leader has to do, he's got to keep one eye over his shoulder, unfortunately, because there are those, we know that they're already with his own party, and even some possible leadership contenders who they're not openly criticizing. Many are lavishing him with love openly, but others, maybe surrogates, are sniping at him from behind. So he's got that double chance, or double challenge, and he's coming into a leadership review in April. One thing he could be doing, added to the things an opposition leader needs to do, there were some bona fide concerns raised by the ethics commissioner before the election. These were real, and it was not wrong or negative for him to bring these up during the election, as some media commentators think. He needs to look at a way of genuinely going, these are genuine concerns, not partisan. There's the ethics commissioner who said there's some serious stuff went on. He needs to also pursue those. I think that would help him in the base, along with it also being the right thing to do.
Yeah, he mentioned, Tiffany, I'll move it over to you, but he mentioned sort of 7 measures or priorities that he was going into the meeting with, and among them was restoring ethics and accountability to government by introducing stronger penalties in the Conflict of Interest Act. There was also stuff about the energy corridor, about the energy sector, Bill C-48 and Bill C-69. A very different tone, though, from Mr. Scheer emerging from that meeting than, for example, the one we heard from Premier Moe, Tiffany.
Yeah, so I mean, I imagine that going into that meeting with 7 priorities, and a couple of which they were able to find some common ground on. So parental leave offerings and pieces that are aimed at young parents. I feel like that was an area I'd actually forgotten about of common ground between the two parties, and I think. I expect, again, an escalation or a sense of a phasing of how his tone changes over the course of the next few weeks. He did mention that, or sort of set the tone around what his expectations of the throne speech are going to be, and aiming and hoping that the government will come closer to what their needs are going to be. So therefore, sort of saying that this government needs to look even further at what their priorities are and come forward with something that they can support. So I expect that sort of that tone of coming a little bit more adversarial as needed as an opposition leader may come then. But again, to Stockwell's point, he's speaking to multiple audiences right now, and it must be exhausting, frankly, to be dealing with his own sort of leadership within his party, and then at the same time need to set a tone for how he speaks to the country as an opposition leader, and looks to seem to be aiming to collaborate while holding the government accountable. Those are really difficult things to do all at once, and he'll be scrutinized in many different ways with each step forward. So today was definitely something to watch.
Both Tiffany and Stockwell kind of hit on that idea that Mr. Scheer is looking, having to look over his own shoulder at his own party, and then as well figure out how to address the issues of the day, how to grow the party potentially in an election if he stays on as leader. All of those things all at once. I think Tiffany used the word exhausting. What do you think?
I think they're all exhausted at this point in time. That's why I don't foresee that the beginning of the session will last very, very long. But that being said, it's exhausting when you don't have a clear path. We have to realize that the Conservatives, in my opinion, will probably be the only real opposition to the Liberal Party, to the Liberal government, for the sole reason that I think the Bloc Québécois, in my opinion, is quite happy to be there, have grown exponentially, and will settle in their job of being the third opposition. No interest in having this government fail too fast. Same with the NDP, by the way, who has zero interest, in my opinion, to go into a next election. So Andrew Scheer has that pressure on him that he has to act like an official opposition, knowing all the other factors that my colleagues just talked about. And at the same time, if he's smart, I would go and talk to the leader of the Bloc and talk to the leader of the NDP and also the Green, because there's some orientations that they can all take together to kind of force the government to do. They might find common grounds. It's not true that all the common grounds have to be found between the Conservative and the Liberal. They might force the hand a bit of the Liberal. We'll see a lot of these power plays being done in committee, where the other parties will have the majority. What type of legislation will they present that will have the support of all the other parties? So it will make the government think a bit more and have to be a bit more, if they play their cards right, the opposition parties, might make for an interesting government, a very tiring government.
Exciting government, you mean.
Exciting,
Murray,
that's what I meant.
Murray, what do you think?
Well, I kind of wonder if the real opposition in some ways might be the provincial premiers, as per what we saw today. As to Stockwell and Tiffany's point, we like our football out here, and the analogy that I can think of is it was almost like Scott Moe was blocking for Andrew Scheer on a punt return today. And guess who gets to run it back and gets all the glory, but without necessarily, getting your head twisted off. And I think there was a lot of things that Scott Moe said today that Andrew Scheer would clearly love to have said, but when you got someone else that's able to say that for you, that's a little bit convenient, isn't it? And national unity, Western alienation, Western separation is of the significance that we're going to be talking about it. So certainly because of that, people like Jason Kenney and Scott Moe are going to have an added voice. So I kind of wonder if this was sort of deliberately, undeliberately coordinated today.
Thanks so much to our power panel this evening. Stockwell Day, Murray Mandrick, Tiffany Gooch, and Françoise Boivin. What happened in today's meetings? Jonathan Wilkinson is a BC Liberal MP and current Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard. He joins us from Vancouver. Hi, Mr. Wilkinson. Nice to see you. Thanks for making time for us.
Not at all. Thank you for the invitation.
I wanted to start off with Premier Moe. We had him on the show earlier today, and he said that the Prime Minister's words about understanding the frustrations in his province weren't made evident in the meeting that he had with Prime Minister Trudeau. Did the Prime Minister express any kind of willingness to negotiate or to be open to discussions, at least, on A, either the equalization formula, or B, suspending the carbon tax for a year in Saskatchewan?
Well, I think certainly the Prime Minister recognizes, and the government certainly recognizes, the concerns of folks in Saskatchewan and Alberta that were expressed prior to and during the election. And it's important that we are thoughtful about how we respond to that. It's part of the reason why the Prime Minister has spoken with many of the premiers and has met with Premier Moe and Premier Pallister. It's part of the reason why he's meeting with all of the opposition leaders. But in terms of the specifics, I mean, on the price on pollution, that was certainly an important issue in the campaign. That is a key part of a climate program. 99 out of 100 economists will tell you it's the most efficient way to reduce emissions. Suspending that in one province really makes very little sense in the context of a national architecture. And I think that it's important for folks who live in Saskatchewan, as I grew up in Saskatchewan, to really understand a part of it which Premier Moe doesn't talk about very often, which is most families actually get more as a rebate associated with the carbon price than they pay in the tax. So I think, you know, in that context, no. I think that we're certainly interested in talking about how we can move forward on climate change in a way that meets some of the needs of Saskatchewan and Alberta, absolutely. But in terms of suspending the carbon price, I don't think that's on the table.
I take your point on the rebate. The particular concern that's being expressed in Saskatchewan as of late, and it even emanated from the leader of the opposition NDP in that province, who previously was more largely supportive of the carbon tax, is the effect that it's having on farmers with a particularly wet crop this year. They're getting dinged quite heavily. Some of them are paying hundreds, if not thousands, of extra dollars on the carbon tax where it applies to natural gas, for example, that they're using to heat their crops or their grains. Is there an openness on the part of your government to discussing that? The suggestion, for example, had been made from the leader of the NDP in that province to rebate farmers who are not part of that, of the rebate that you already mentioned.
Well, I think that it's important, as I said, I mean, we're always open to constructive suggestions. We're open to talking about some of the issues that may be helpful to address some of the concerns that farmers have. But you will know that in terms of the price on pollution, that much of farming is excluded from the price on pollution. But what you're talking about is there's a specific event where they've had a very wet fall. There's a lot of grain drying that's going on to try to salvage much of the crop, and so there has been discussion about whether or not there's a way to address that. That has been brought forward by Mr. Miley, who is the opposition leader in Saskatchewan. I think he has raised it with Minister McKenna. He's certainly raised it with me as well. And those are the kinds of constructive suggestions that I would say we're looking for from all players in Saskatchewan and Alberta as to how we engage in a way where we can meet some of the legitimate concerns that are being expressed.
So you are open to that suggestion?
We're certainly open to the conversation, and we're open to a conversation across a range of things. But I think what we're looking for are constructive suggestions. I mean, on the whole point of equalization, if there are ideas that people can bring forward, whether that's Premier Moe or Premier Kenney, I think that people are open to the conversation. But you have to remember that both Premier Moe and Premier Kenney were at the table in 2018 when the last changes to equalization were put forward and were agreed upon. This is a program that requires the approval of most of the provinces as well as the federal government. And so are we open to having constructive conversations on these issues and on any issue? Of course we are. I mean, we would be crazy as a government to say that we're not.
Back in 2018, Premier Moe did put forward a pretty specific suggestion on equalization, a sort of 50-50 split where half of it, the formula would stand as is, and the other half would be based on a per capita formula. Is that something that your government would consider? Because his indication today was that the Prime Minister did not show any willingness to reconsider the equalization arrangements.
Well, equalization comes up for renegotiation periodically. I mean, there have been many changes to the equalization program over the course of years, but it's not just the federal government that a particular province needs to convince. It's their provincial counterparts, the premiers of the other provinces. So in the context of discussions that go on a federal provincial basis, will we be having conversations about equalization and how it can be improved? Of course we will. If people have specific ideas they want to bring to that table, then by all means they should, but they need to be constructive. They need to be things that they think that can garner the support of their colleagues.
But this isn't just in that general context, with respect. This is in the context of two provinces that didn't vote for a single Liberal MP, didn't elect a single Liberal MP. Two provinces who feel as though they are, and I understand that there's a formula at play here, 100%. This is based on their capacity to raise revenue, but feel as though they are being stifled in their potential economic growth by other regions of the country while they are a net contributor to the Federation.
So there are clearly both short-term and longer-term issues that we need to work, collectively with the premiers of those provinces and with all stakeholders in those provinces to address. Those relate to the downturn in the energy sector in the short term. They relate to the issues around how we move to a lower carbon future and fight climate change in a way that's going to allow Alberta and Saskatchewan to continue to be successful from an economic perspective. Those are important conversations that we need to engage, but we need to engage and we need to dial down the partisan rhetoric. We need to actually have conversations that are about how do we actually move forward on these things? I mean, I grew up in Saskatchewan. I went to university in Saskatchewan. I worked for the Premier of Saskatchewan. I did federal-provincial relations for the province of Saskatchewan. I feel very close to that province, and I think that historically, Saskatchewan premiers have been entirely constructive in the way that they've approached this, whether it's Premier Blakeney, Premier Romano, Premier Douglas, Premier Thatcher. And that's what I think what we need to do generally is we need to dial down the rhetoric and we need to start to look for solutions that are going to address some of the concerns, which are legitimate concerns, but we need to do it in a way that's going to work for the Federation as a whole.
Is it just Premier Moe responsible for that rhetoric, though? I mean, there was a campaign run essentially against Doug Ford and all of his policies, and Conservative premiers like Doug Ford and a Conservative government like Doug Ford. That's what we kept hearing from your party during the campaign.
Well, look, I think that we all could do well to reflect on the campaign and to think about how we can move towards collaborating better as a federation. I don't think that anyone can say that nobody ran the perfect campaign. But I do think that in the aftermath of the campaign, the way Canada is successful is when we work together. And Canada is a country that is very diverse geographically. It's very diverse in a whole range of ways. It works because we all are very committed to being Canadian, and we work towards finding solutions that are going to meet the needs, particularly the pressing needs of specific regions as they evolve. And that is something we need to do now, but we need to all sort of step back and say, this is not about partisan politics, it's about people's lives, it's about fighting climate change and the future of this planet. And we need to be thoughtful about how we do that, and we need to ensure that we've got all of the various voices in the room working in the same direction. And that's certainly something that our government is committed to doing.
I take your point on the thoughtfulness and putting aside all the rhetoric on whichever side. We have also interviewed a number of people, a number of mayors, a number of even local politicians in both Saskatchewan and Alberta. And the one common theme, and I wouldn't say their interests or what they say is completely homogenous, but the one common thing I keep hearing is that they're hoping for very concrete action. Whatever it is, something actually has to happen sooner rather than later. Will there be something at the start of this Parliament to acknowledge the concerns coming from Saskatchewan and Alberta? Will there be something concrete, or is this going to be an extended sort of consultation?
Well, I mean, I think that's a little bit hard to say. We certainly are going to be looking at what can be done in the short term. But part of this does require consultation. It does require reaching out to stakeholders. It does require trying to find pathways that can work for these provinces, and particularly for the energy sector. I mean, part of what we're talking about here is the challenges facing the energy sector in the context of a world that is moving towards being lower carbon. And so we need to be thinking about how we ensure that we are doing things collectively as Canadians to ensure that all provinces and the people who live in all provinces can be successful. That is something that we are very much committed to doing. It's certainly something that I am very much committed to doing, and I honestly think that it is eminently doable. I mean, I worked with Premier Moe on environmental issues when I was Parliamentary Secretary to Minister McKenna. We did a lot of work on issues around protecting boreal caribou in Saskatchewan, and I think that there are lots of common interests and commonalities that we can build upon, but we need to dial down the rhetoric and start to work. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for making time for us today, Mr. Wilkinson. Pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you. BC Liberal MP Jonathan Wilkinson. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.